So a big announcement at the recent Nintendo Direct was that they're finally doing what literally everyone has been asking them to do and releasing a combination of Game Boy Classic, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on the Switch Virtual Console. It's not called the Virtual Console, it's the Nintendo Switch Online Game Boy Advance or Game Boy Classic emulation thing. Nintendo, it's just NSO, whatever you want to call it. But basically, they are doing what they should have done about 5 years ago when the Switch actually launched, which is actually closer to 6 years now, which is scaring me, and have ported some games from the Wii U eShop Virtual Console to the Switch. Now, this includes things like Metroid Fusion, which is fantastic because more people should play Metroid Fusion, especially after the success of Dread. And it includes also another version of Tetris, which of course means you can now play Tetris 8 different ways on the Nintendo Switch.
What are you talking
Each
about?
one of
Another
them-
version of Tetris? It's the Game Boy Tetris, the original Tetris, the OG Tetris, the bestest
it's
Tetris.
yet another Tetris. It's just another one.
It's not just another
Which
It's
is
one.
great.
hardcore Tetris. You can't
It's-
save your pieces.
It's the ultimate Tetris for the hardcore. That's exactly right. You can't save your pieces, and it keeps fucking me up every time I play this bloody game.
To breach our audiences and reach out to the younger generation which don't know about this Game Boy Tetris and think that the original is released on the PlayStation 2 or something like that. The Alan's smart. He's broadening our horizons.
It is the Tetris that is responsible for Nintendo still being here today. If it wasn't for Tetris selling a billion copies of that
version of Tetris.
If it wasn't for Tetris selling a billion copies of the Game Boy, then Nintendo may not be here. That's how important.
We can all learn this on the Apple Store documentary of Tetris the movie.
There's an Apple Store documentary on Tetris.
Yeah, there's the Apple TV movie coming out. Didn't
really?
You see the trailer?
Oh my goodness!
It dropped like a few weeks back. The new trailer for the Tetris movie. It's like a mockumentary.
I am subscribed to that thing, and I've never watched a single thing on it. And now
I don't think it's out till later in the year, but the latest trailer just came out, and everyone's talking about it again because it was a bit over the top in some things, but still really good. Looks like a fun blast. So
yeah, I'm totally keen on that. Anyway, the Game Boy Tetris is good. It's excellent.
You
can't save your pieces.
I have such a vivid memory of playing it on a clear plastic original Game Boy, like the ones that you could see through. You could see all the bits and bobs inside of it. It was so cool.
Yeah,
that's not the original.
But
Game Boy, you can see.
But
that was the purple. The purple Game Boy Pocket was the first clear one, wasn't it? Yeah.
Let me find it.
Yeah,
anyway,
the clear chunk.
Anyway, the Game Boy on the Nintendo Switch, it's actually good. Before we talk further than it, the apps themselves are really good. The way they've emulated them onto the Switch is really good. So, they've done a great job of kind of capturing the aesthetics of the screen, because as everybody I think knows, I have a lot of emulation consoles, and I've been playing a lot of these games anyway via those things over the last couple of years. And always the screens are more modern in design, and the emulators don't capture the original quality of those screens. But if you put the Switch on with the filters, then you can have a very close experience to what it was like to actually play these original consoles. So the emulators, these two have been really impressed. They've really impressed me, and I'm very happy that they're there finally, as late as they are. As Alan said, it is good that they're there, and I'm looking forward to there being more games on them because they launched a little bit thin, I feel, in terms of
there's not
content.
that many options.
There's only 6 GBA games at the moment, I think. There's a lot more confirmed. They've actually said, for example, Fire Emblem's coming, and I don't think Metroid's there yet. Metroid's coming, and Golden Sun's coming. And so a lot of really great GBA games are already confirmed. But yeah, at the moment, there's only 6 of them. And I think on the Game Boy emulator, there might be 7 or 8. Again, with more to come. But yeah, they did launch a little bit thin. Give themselves some room to build up over the next
It's okay,
couple of
they
months.
can start it again on the
Very
next
Nintendo.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
the NES and Super NES apps also launched pretty thin, and now there's like 100 games on each of those. So they'll get there, I'm sure. There's certainly a lot of content that they can bring out. Like both the GBA Game Boy and GBA had a lot of excellent games. So I'm looking forward to seeing what they can get on there. Because one of the ones that actually really caught my attention was Alone in the Dark on the Game Boy Color, which is the oddest, most obscure game you can possibly imagine that they've just kind of stuck on there. So that gives me some hope that we'll see some stuff that's not like just the Nintendo games on there.
It's weird, but I'm here for it. The real goal would be to get the Resident Evil Game Boy port that they made and then discontinued halfway through. It was
Oh,
like
you're
full
talking about
3D.
the cancelled one.
Yeah, that'd be cool as hell.
Well, yeah, they did you know that the developers or somebody actually got the actual ROM of that and dumped it on Internet Archive, and a lot of people have played it. They actually got it pretty much done. It got to
It's
90% of development
insane.
or something, and I've played it. It's pretty neat. I would have really enjoyed it as a kid. I understand why they cancelled it because apparently Capcom was like, well, this isn't very scary, so that's why they cancelled it. And
No.
you play it, and it's not very scary, but you know, it is
What are you expecting?
yeah, and it is the actual Resident Evil just demade down into Game Boy form. It would have been a lot of fun. I would have loved it as a kid. But anyway, let's talk about the games that we'd like to see come out on these platforms going forward. Brad, is there a particular game that you would like to see on either the Game Boy or Game Boy Advance um, platforms that maybe hasn't been announced yet?
Yeah, I'm going to go with the original Game Boy, and I'm going to start with Donkey Kong 94.
Is that the puzzle
Yo,
one?
Yeah, that's kind of
yeah.
like you start with the original levels of Donkey Kong, and then it goes into like platforming puzzle.
Yeah, that was a fun little game.
Yeah, I
Well,
like
that was
how it
the
kind of
origin
taught
of.
you different taught you new moves in the cutscenes as you progress through the game, and then like you could go back and replay it, and then because you know all the moves, you can finish like the original levels in like 2 seconds because you just backflip all the way to the top.
Because that's the original like inspiration for the minis games, right?
Yes, that's where they
Yeah,
came
like
from.
Mario
Yeah.
versus Donkey Kong and all those.
Yeah. That's pretty neat. I
Yeah,
like that.
that was a pretty neat little game. I'm sure that one will come because it is a Nintendo thing. Like I'm pretty sure Nintendo has all the
Yeah, it's pretty
rights they
guaranteed.
need to actually port that. So yeah, I'm certain that'll come at some point.
Yeah.
What about
There's so many games. There's so many games on the Game Boy Advance and the GB, like the original Game Boy. It's insane to me. Like I was thinking about it because we were posing this question in the Slack today, and I literally had a moment of which do I pick? Because they're all cool. Um, Even like weird licensed games. Like it's insane to me that I think of this, but I think of the Game Boy Advance and I think of Inspector Gadget Advanced Mission, a horrible game, but oh my lord, is it not just the most nostalgic thing in the history of mankind for me? Like I want rubbish nostalgic licensed games, and it's not going to happen, but I want it.
speaking
Well, they
speaking of
brought
license?
GoldenEye out. They could bring out. Sorry, Matt.
Yeah,
They
go
could
ahead.
bring out that James Bond game. It was kind of like a top-down Zelda game, but James Bond.
Oh yes,
There seems to be a
no,
lot of
stop it.
push to bring it in. They're like everyone's like now GoldenEye's on it. It's like bring the Game Boy one.
Or
Such
the
a weird game.
Perfect Dark for the Game Boy. Was it Game Boy? There was a Perfect Dark as well.
Former color, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. No, but you're right about the license thing, Alan. Like one of the things that I always remember fondly about the GBA was the Lord of the Rings um, licensed
Beat 'em
games.
ups.
Yeah,
Yeah.
when EA had the license and they made the kind of Diablo-like games, and
Really good.
they were good fun. Like I really enjoyed them, and I'd love to say we won't, of course, because EA doesn't have the license for those anymore. But I would love to see those again.
Well, this is not a Game Boy game, but I would love to see the Lord of the Rings the Final Fantasy X game at some point to come back, but it's not going to happen.
Yeah, that was a great game. The Third Age,
That was
that
so
was.
weird.
Well, there was a
Third
GBA
Age,
Third
yeah.
Age as well, which was very different. And it's a unique kind of strategy game. I don't think I've ever seen anything quite like it since either. Where so the kind of it's a tactics RPG, like vaguely like Fire Emblem, I guess. But the battlefield was split into 3 sections, and in each section you had a commander, right? So it could be like Boromir or Aragon or Legolas or whoever. And each of those leaders had a certain number of command points, and they could use those command points to command a certain number of troops on their section on their turn. So you wouldn't be able to control all of your characters or all your soldiers, and you had to move around the battlefield quite tactically. It was a really neat, interesting, different game. Totally different to the Final Fantasy X likes on the PlayStation and GameCube, but the GBA one really got me as well. Again, I'd love to see it. We won't, because again,
We
EA
will
doesn't
never
have that
see it,
license
yeah.
anymore. But yeah, that was a fun game. The GBA had so much experimentation on it like that. It was good. It was good for that.
Well,
Trent.
license
That's
games
such
in
a cool
general around
console.
that era were like that. Like everything was just like the Harry Potter ones, for example, were completely different to the console games. Like there was anything which was licensed by EA was actually like EA was in that evil era. Like everyone was like, "Oh, EA is evil," but like everything they did on the Game Boy Advance was probably like gold tier, like great nostalgic, like just experimental great RPGs, like for all that licensed stuff. Like you had Lord of the Rings, Harry Potter. There was a few others out there that time as well. But yeah. But yeah, going to what I want to bring in, I want to bring in some the Sims games like Herbs and
Oh,
Castaway and
this
all that sort of stuff. Yeah.
the narrative Sims games on the GBA and DS were so insane, and I loved them. They were not what I expected because I wanted the Sims, and then it came out, and you were like, it was just a light RPG. So I'm completely on board with you here, Trent. Absolutely, bring him back.
See, I would
Yeah, it
have
was
thought
kind
you
of
would
like,
have. I would have thought you would have said Survival Kids, Tread.
oh, well, Survivor Kids, there's 3 games you told me to pick. Survival Kids for later in the segment.
I
When
was
you've
sure
had
you were
more
going to.
coffee, when you've had more coffee and Alan's
And
had
then
more
I was
alcohol.
sure you're going to bring up Final Fantasy Tactics Advanced then as well, just so you could mention the snowball fight.
It does need to
It
come
was going to
out.
happen.
It was going to happen.
It's
It would be good.
inevitable.
It would be good to have that actually on the. They won't, because if Square Enix was to do a Final Fantasy Tactics again, they'd release it as a separate game and charge you $150 for it. So
I
they're
think
not
they
going
would
to.
Yeah,
just make a
and
new one at this point. Like
Yeah,
they've
then
sort of got that revival of some of their older stuff, but it's all new releases or ports and stuff like that. So yeah.
they did it with Tactics Ogre, so they're not going to release their games on the Virtual Console, but that would be neat.
They could 2.5 HD remake it in the style of all those other tactics games and Live a Life, and yeah, they could do that. That'd be great.
There is one that may happen, I guess. I mean, it's feasible, I guess. There was a tactics RPG that was released on the GBA, which I'd like to see, Onimusha Tactics. So
that's a weird game. It's so
yeah,
cool.
Onimusha was
Yo,
a great series on the PlayStation 2. The kind of
it was
horror style action games from
yeah.
Capcom. Capcom kind of deep in its Resident Evil and Devil May Cry, early era Devil May Cry, did this kind of medieval samurai horror thing that they called Onimusha, which was excellent. The third one actually on the PS2 had Jean Reno
It was
in
so weird
a
because he went
starring
back in
role,
time. He
which
got
yeah,
isekai'd.
which was great. But they did a Onimusha for the GBA, but they couldn't obviously do the full 3D horror thing, so they didn't. Instead, they made this tactics RPG, which was odd, but excellent. It was one of the better tactics RPGs on the platform, I thought, and I could see that one happening, because they got no other
It's
way to release
interesting
it
how
again.
many because it was cheap to produce for the GBA, so they basically just threw money at random devs and said, "Right, go make us a game in this license. Go."
Well, that was the
and
thing.
they'd
Like
come back
most,
with the weirdest stuff. It was great.
yeah, that was like that's why these consoles had so many creative games on them, because the teams that were working on them were tiny, right? So you could make
Yeah, it was like a guy in a basement.
you could make a game on the Game Boy with a team of 5 or 6 people, or you could make a game on the GBA with a team of 10 people, and they had a whole bunch of studios that were kind of specialists on that platform, and the big publishers or whatever wanted to do a game with their really well-known licenses, but weren't able to do kind of a port because the GBA and Game Boy weren't powerful enough to port console games. So they gave these projects to these kind of specialist developers and said, can you do something using the license that will work on this console? And they came up with some crazy ideas to to make them work, which was great. It was a very creative time
Just
for game
extraordinary
development.
backers.
I
I
know.
mean, we are talking about things that have been announced already here, but the fact they've got Kirby's Amazing Mirror online is so cool, and it's almost enough to make me want to subscribe to the Nintendo Switch Online Plus, whatever it's called, because it is very neat to play a Game Boy Advance game online.
Oh, you're not a subscriber, Alan.
No, I just do the base one because I don't really play online on Switch anyway. I just
Yeah,
use it for
fair enough.
Xenoblade.
The N64 stuff online is really good as well, because don't forget that console's there as well, and it's got GoldenEye and Mario Golf and Mario Tennis and Mario Kart and Winback and a whole
Yeah.
bunch of other great multiplayer games. But yeah, being able to play Super Mario Kart Advance. What's the Mario Kart Advance called?
Super Circuit.
Super
Mario
Circuit.
Kart Advance Super Circuit.
There we go. Super Circuit. Being able to play that online is really good fun. Great game.
I don't know why you want to though. In a
Four
world,
Swords as well.
Of course,
Oh.
Four Swords. Yes.
oh,
Wait, did
could
they
you
actually
imagine?
release Four Swords? Or no?
Not yet.
I was just excited because I really wanted Four Swords, and I was really disappointed. So the Game Boy Advance had Four Swords. The 3DS had Triforce Heroes. The Switch has 2 controllers, 2 Joy-Cons. Why wasn't there a dual Zelda game where it's like, here's a Joy-Con, here's a Joy-Con. Let's play a Four Sword style game. Why didn't that happen? It is like marketing genius, like instantly, like millions of dollars just by making that game. It's stupid that never happened.
It is. I agree with you fully. It is wild to me how they've basically just like said, no, we don't like money. Let's not make a game that everyone will be like, oh hell yeah, about.
I think that's
It's
sort of
so strange.
sidetracking here, but I'm really disappointed that that whole Joy-Con like thing like just phased off in terms of what Nintendo was doing and the what their Switch marketing was. Like when it first was like announced and like the first initial thing, it was like everyone can have a Joy-Con, you can have a Joy-Con, you can have a Joy-Con, and that became successful. And it's like, well, everyone has a Switch now. No one needs to like do that cool sharing thing. You're on a basketball court. Here's the Switch. Let's play some Joy-Con while we're playing basketball. While listening
but
to
no one
like
did that.
Believe by
Yeah, but
Imagine Dragons.
nobody did that, Trent. So that's why
No
they
one
stopped
in
doing
the
that.
world did that.
Yeah,
Nintendo sold me on a dream and I never got it.
yeah, that's why they stopped doing that though. Nobody played it that way.
Love the idea.
Back to
I have this image of Trent in my mind of him going to a basketball court and no one's there, and it starts raining while he pulls the Joy-Cons off his Switch.
the Game Boy and the Game Boy Advance. The one, probably the game that I would like to see most, again, probably won't happen, but Heroes of Might and Magic 2, the Game Boy Color port, that's got to be the game I played the most on that console. It was very much a demake of Heroes of Might and Magic 2, but having that in portable form back in the day was just amazing. That you had this full-on strategy game that you could play for all night, and it had that very much kind of one more turn quality to it. I'd love to see that somehow land there. Who knows? Maybe Ubisoft will come to play and drop it on there. That'd be nice. There was also
the real goal here is to convince people that like the weird subgenre games that came from those bigger series that they're worthwhile playing. Because I feel like nowadays, when you say like, "Oh, I'm playing a game from Heroes of Might and Magic," but it's not the ones you think of, everyone immediately thinks, "Ah, shit, mobile game." And it wasn't the case always. And it's so sad that it's now like devolved into the idea that a spin-off game on a handheld is shit. I want it to go back to being nice and pleasant. I want good games again. I want cool, interesting, weird experiments that kind of don't work sometimes, but are still neat.
I mean,
Like
back
all
in those
the weird.
days, like the weird games were sometimes the better games. Like it's like all the console games would be like, these big blockbusters, and then it's like the Wii or the like GameCube or like the Game Boy Advance would have this weird offshoot game, and it had some quirky little, quality to it, and be made by some really, really like bizarrely great developer. And it's like this. Why is no one playing this? It's like the better game.
All the VR rally games on Game Boy Advance that were like the faux 3D were incredible.
I love
Like they were
those.
so good.
I
They
really
were
love
so
those.
impressive as well.
The little cars always look like those toys,
Yeah,
the kind of
little like Hot
collectible
Wheels.
toys. Yeah, exactly. I love those. And then yeah, it was really impressive that they managed to get those into that kind of faux 3D thing that worked. I mean, it was the same for the first person shooters that the GBA got. There were a couple of those.
I was
And
about to say Doom on the GBA, amazing.
yeah, or Serious Sam was the other one that I played a lot of. I don't know if anybody else remembers Serious Sam on the GBA, but yeah, that was a lot of fun as well.
I remember being a child and seeing it in a store and being like, "That looks cool," and my mum telling me, "No, it's too violent for you." And I remember being really upset because I thought I was a big kid because I just left grade 3.
There was you
What
came
time to be
off the
alive?
GBA as well, wasn't there?
Yeah,
I'm pretty
but
sure they did a port of that.
it was a weird port though.
Was it?
Yeah, apparently it was like half the levels, but not. It was like half levels, but they were all changed, so it
Right.
still wasn't it.
You know, the
It's
most
odd.
the first person shooter that I perhaps remember most on the GBA because the story behind it was just nuts was X versus Sever. So
Yo, yeah, from the movie.
yeah, but it was a weird one, right? So X versus Sever was this first person shooter that was based on a movie that hadn't come out yet. And they released the game, and then the movie got delayed for like 3 years or something. So it was pretty much the only licensed game that wasn't actually, attached to a movie. And then the movie came out,
I
and it
love
was the
that.
worst thing ever. It was terrible movie, absolutely terrible. So probably just as well for them that it came out. It got
The
delayed.
game was like okay.
The
Like I
game
don't
was
remember
alright.
hating X versus Sever.
Yeah, the game was
It was the
alright,
worst thing of all time.
but the movie was just. It was Antonio Banderas and Lucy Liu, was it?
I mean, that is a great bloody combo.
It could have been good,
How can you
but
not love Antonio Banderas?
it could have been good, but yeah, it was just. And it was, the story behind it was just hilarious.
Such a weird experience. I want weird games like that on the Switch. Screw it. Give me like
You,
the weird, strange games that don't make any sense. I
I
want
just
the
you know
wonder.
most
what should
absurd.
be put onto the Game Boy Advance stuff? The Bit Generations games. They need to be on the Game Boy Advance stuff.
Yeah, but they were all Japan only at the time.
No, they didn't. They came out in Australia. I had them. I had like 1 or 2 of them, didn't I? They came out.
No, they.
I'm sure they came out like there were like English versions, and then
No,
it was
They
like
re-released some for the DS Lite.
yeah,
the
they were all.
DS
They
Lite.
were
Maybe
all.
that's why I'm confusing.
They
Yeah.
were all remade for the DSi and WiiWare as art style games, but the
Yes.
Bit Generation originals were all Japan only.
They still should bring out the originals. It's not that hard to bring out the original Game Boy Advance games.
Yeah, I mean that'd be great. I certainly wouldn't say no to them because yeah, some of those games were favorites of mine. I really like the what was it called? Hexite, I think it was in English on the DSi. I don't know what it was called in Japan, but it was the one where you had like a grid of hexagons and you had to fill it with colors. They
Yes,
kind of
that
keep
was actually
dropping
my
down the
favorite
screen.
too. The Hex
Yeah.
game.
Yeah, that was a really neat little game. I'd like to see that. They could put that on the GBA and conceivably, I guess, localize it for the
Because it
first time.
kind of reminded me of there was like a game in the 90s on the PC called Hexagon. It kind of remind me of that. So like you'd like do the piece and then you like get like move another piece and then it makes a sound if you like, get extra hexagons. It was great. I'm sure someone listening knows what I'm on about.
Yeah. I don't. Yeah, I mean, the one thing I guess it'd be interesting for me to see how many people are actually playing these things, because the Game Boy in particular was very much a product of its time, and we've well and truly gone past the period where it was just retro. We're talking about, downright archaic now. And while we here are all pretty pumped about having that on the Switch and being able to play those games, I just wonder whether they have any kind of resonance with younger players. It's a little bit like the NES, I guess, that the NES games are possibly a bit too old, that unless you have particular nostalgia for them, it's a little bit hard to pick them up today. I think the Super Nintendo and onwards, the quality of the games were such, and they were modern enough that people who didn't grow up with that console can go back to it and enjoy it. And I think the GBA is that as well to an extent. But definitely, I think the Game Boy, the stuff that's on there is really only for people that I think grew up with the Game Boy. Well, I might be wrong. I don't know. I don't know how other people are responding to it, but I just remember that when they put the for a simple example, when they put Pokemon Blue on the Game Boy, the virtual console on the 3DS, there were a lot of people that loved Pokemon from the later games but hadn't played the original, and they found it very, very difficult to get into that original Pokemon Blue or Red. So I don't know. I don't know if there is much of a. I just don't know how people would get along with Pokemon. Sorry, with Game Boy if they didn't grow up with it. So yeah, are there any other games that people would like to see? That
Survival Kids.
Survival Kids, yes, Trent. I mean,
And
Survival
the
Kids,
Japanese Survival Kids too.
Survival Kids would actually be good. Like, it would be genuinely good. I think that game holds up pretty nicely, actually.
And
I
it's not
like
so
the
much a
art
game,
style.
but, with the filters for like the original Game Boy and the Game Boy Color, I'd like to see them implement the Super Game Boy somehow.
Oh yes, because Survival Kids had that too. It had like a background around it.
They do that
Yeah,
already,
and
don't
like
they?
Wario Blast.
Yeah.
Well, they do that already, don't they? Like
No,
because if you're playing Tetris, for example, it's all colored now.
yeah, you can do the Game Boy Color filters, but there were some games that were like Super Game Boy, so they took advantage of some of the Super Nintendo's hardware.
Yeah,
Like special backgrounds and more colors and things like that.
I remember the Super Game Boy. I thought that it was basically assuming that already for some reason, because I thought that the Tetris, like I said, if you play Tetris on it's kind of in color, and I thought that was what happened when you plugged it into your Super Game Boy.
Yeah, it's pretty much the same, but I think there were just some games that were between the Game Boy Color and the original Game Boy that were like Super Nintendo enhanced, I guess.
Right.
There was something in the game that only the Super Nintendo could push hardware wise. So there was some like cosmetic changes and things like that to games that you could only do for the Super Game Boy.
Right. I mean, I remember Tetris 2. Was it called Tetris 2?
Yeah, that was the Super Game Boy Advanced one.
Yeah, I remember playing that a lot on the Super NES. And yeah, it was different to what you could do with when you had it plugged into your Game Boy. But yeah, for some reason, I thought that the emulator was already doing that. I'm sure they could. There's no reason they couldn't do that.
Yeah, like I haven't found like just looking at the online emulators. I'm not sure the emulation community's really put Super Game Boy stuff like haven't really implemented it. So I'm not sure if it's like a hard thing to do because it requires Super Nintendo hardware. I'm not sure how it all works in the background.
Oh,
I'm
right.
not
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, gotcha. You might be right. It might be difficult to do. So maybe they don't do it on the Nintendo on the Switch either. There weren't that many
It would be
games that
cool.
relied on that.
No.
Yeah. Well, I think that kind of covers us there.
Some
And
Game Boy games coming out. It's exciting.
yeah,
It's very exciting stuff.
overall, the one that I'm looking forward to the most is just having Fire Emblem come out on the, because that one's already been confirmed, of course, and having that
Yeah,
on my Switch
that is cool.
will be great again. Not that I haven't played it like 3 million times on emulators already, but the original Fire Emblem is my favorite. And then after that, all we have to do is wait for Nintendo to get around to doing GameCube. That's the last.
Well, it's not going to happen
GameCube
anymore
would be
because
great.
they've probably realized that Metroid Prime made a shit ton of money.
Yeah, and once they do the Bait and Katos 1 and 2 release, then they've kind of tapped out of GameCube games anyway. There weren't that many of them.
I'm excited for that though.
Oh,
I
that'll
I
be
also
great.
think that
series now.
GameCube is like probably like on the horizon for like the next console. Like they'd be up to then when they want to do GameCube. I think we'll be doing Nintendo 64 and Game Boy and stuff like that for a long time before we even get to GameCube stuff this generation.
I don't think there's any more N64 games that'll come. I think they've kind of tapped out of what they can bring to that platform. They're just, the N64 didn't have that many games in the first place, and then once you take out the ones that are out of license and would be impossible to bring to the platform, I think one of the reasons that they did the GBA and Game Boy virtual consoles was they just didn't have anything else to release on the existing platforms. So this gives them another runway for more games. But yeah, you're probably right that we won't see GameCube on the N6 on the Switch. I think that the platforms we've got now are probably it, unless they want to add like Game Gear. Game Gear would be all right.
Maybe it would be cool. Play the Game Gear version of Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine.
No, the one I think Nintendo should do, they should work with Hamster, right? And do an arcade virtual console as well.
Oh, yeah.
Because Hamster's got like 300,000 arcade archives on the Switch. If Nintendo was to work with them to do that in subscription form, then that would be amazing.
Yeah, I don't know if it'll happen, but it'd be cool.
It probably won't, but it just makes more sense than selling them individually. Like $10 for each arcade game is probably limiting to the number of people that'll pick them up. But if they had an arcade archive as part of the subscription service, then I think a lot of people would make a lot of use of that. So, if you're tuning in, Nintendo, have a chat to Hamster.
Game and Watch could also be reasonable. Like if they do like somehow work out how to do Game and Watch on it.
Oh yeah, Game and Watch
I'm
would
going
be
to be
good.
controversial here and say no one will play them except for like people who play them as a kid. Because I played a couple of Game and Watch games as a kid and I hated them.
No,
Yeah,
they're great.
You were away from your computer for a second there, Alan, but I actually said basically that about the Game Boy, that I'm not sure that anybody who didn't grow up with the Game Boy is particularly fussed about that console. It's just a little bit perhaps archive, But I think I think you're right with. I use Pokemon as an example. You should listen in, Alan. You shouldn't walk away from your computer sometimes.
Well, we'll see what happens next week. Well, it'll be the podcast will be out by the time it happens anyway. But the Pokemon event, apparently, it's rumored that Blue and Red are going to be announced for the Game Boy, and that's like the fan expectation. So it's not going to happen anyway. Like that's what's that. But if it did happen, then it'll be interesting to see.
Well, there's no reason there's no reason it can't happen because they've already done virtual console versions of Red and Blue. But like I was saying earlier, people who love Pokemon but got into the series later and then went back to try and play Red and Blue on the 3DS when it came out on the virtual console, a lot of them found it way too difficult to get into because it was just like you can't.
It's archaic.
Yeah, it's archaic. There's no running shoes, for example, so everything moves a bit slower and the
It's a game
animations.
for nerds.
Yeah, people like me who grew up with it. I mean, if you if you're nostalgic, then yeah, the Game Boy is definitely a thing. But if you didn't grow up with that console, I just don't. It's like the NES, like I said. I just don't see that having an appeal to people who came to gaming later. And certainly, Game and Watch would be the same. But it
It's
would be
worse than
good.
Game Watch because those games last 2 minutes each, and they are bad.
Well,
They
there's
are not
Game Boy
bad. They
Advance
are
collections.
excellent.
They can put it onto the game. They can put the Game Boy Advance collections onto the Game Boy Advance Virtual Console.
Well, I'm
They're-
surprised
So
they
I played
didn't.
them.
I'm surprised they didn't do that because Game and Watch collection on the GBA was basically all the Game and Watch anyway. They put one of the other Game and Watch on the Game Boy thing, Game and Watch 3, I think, is on there now, and you can play that. But why they didn't put the advanced one, which had every game on it, on the GBA one, I don't know. But anyway,
Money.
Nintendo, it's all the same. It's the platforms are already there. I don't get it. I don't get Nintendo sometimes.
Have it, but they refuse.